The dining room went quiet the second my mother set down her wine glass, and I remember thinking, even before she opened her mouth, that something in the air had changed. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before a slap. 22 people were crammed around 3 folding tables pushed together under my parents' chandelier, Easter ham steaming in the center, and my mother, Linda, stood up like she was about to give a toast. "I want to say something," she said, and she smiled the smile she always used right before she detonated something. "Claire has decided to be generous this year." I had decided no such thing. I did not even know what she meant yet, and already my stomach had dropped through the floor, because I have spent 47 years learning to read that particular smile the way sailors learn to read a darkening sky. "Denise and Rick and the kids are going to move into Claire's house on Birchwood Lane," my mother announced, beaming around the table like she was handing out a prize. "Just until they get back on their feet. Isn't that wonderful? Claire has more space than she needs, and family takes care of family." For a moment, nobody breathed. My sister Denise looked down at her plate with the practiced modesty of someone who already knew exactly what was coming and had rehearsed her grateful face in the mirror. Her husband Rick did not even bother pretending to be surprised. Their oldest, Mia, 16 and sharp as a blade, looked straight at me across the table with an expression I would not fully understand until much later, an expression that was trying, silently, to warn me. "That's not something I agreed to," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My mother's smile did not move, but her eyes went hard the way they always did when a plan met resistance. "Don't be difficult, Claire. It's one house. You live alone in that big place with nobody to share it. Denise has 3 children and nowhere to go. You've always been the easy one. You always have been." The easy one. 3 words, and 40 years of my life folded up neatly inside them. I want you to understand something before I go any further into this story, because I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of quiet I was sitting in that Easter Sunday, and exactly what kind of storm I already had, without anyone at that table knowing it, sitting locked in a fireproof drawer 11 miles away. If you have ever had to draw a line with your own family and felt the whole room turn against you for it, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I have a feeling a lot of you already know exactly the silence I'm describing. I did not raise my voice at that table. I did not cry, though something in my chest was screaming loud enough to drown out the chandelier's soft electric hum. I looked at my mother and I said one word. "No." The word landed in that room like a dropped plate. My father, Walter, who had not said a single thing all dinner besides asking someone to pass the rolls, finally looked up, blinking like a man roused from a nap he'd been enjoying for 30 years. My Aunt Carol set down her fork. Rick actually laughed, a short, ugly bark of disbelief, like the punchline of the whole visit had just landed. "No?" my mother repeated, and her voice climbed half an octave, sweetness curdling into something sharper. "Claire, think about what you're saying. Those are your sister's children, your own blood." "I heard you," I said. "The answer is still no." What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, sitting there under that chandelier with their forks halfway to their mouths, was that I had spent the last 4 months quietly preparing for exactly this moment. What none of them knew was that my grandmother, gone 11 years now, had left me a letter that I had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. And that letter had a single line in it I would end up repeating back to my mother, word for word, on the day everything finally came apart. They had no idea what was coming. And neither, honestly, did I. Not yet, not completely. But I knew enough. I knew the house on Birchwood Lane was never going to belong to anyone but me. And I was about to find out exactly how far my own mother was willing to go to take it anyway. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the years underneath it. My name is Claire Winslow, And at the time all of this happened, I was 47 years old, living alone in a 3-bedroom Craftsman on Birchwood Lane in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. I had bought that house 9 years earlier, in the spring after my grandmother Dorothy, everyone called her Dottie, passed away. And I had bought it with a combination of my own savings, a decade of work as an interior architect and home stager, and an inheritance from Dottie that had felt, at the time, like both a gift and a wound, because it came from losing the one person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen something other than a disappointment or a convenience. I should tell you about my family, because you cannot understand what happened at that Easter table without understanding the shape of the family that built it. My mother, Linda, was 69 years old that year, a retired school administrator who had spent her whole life organizing other people's behavior with the tidy efficiency of a woman who believed, deep in her bones, that love was a currency to be rationed according to usefulness. My father, Walter, was 71, a quiet, conflict-avoidant man who had spent 4 decades letting my mother make every decision in the household, and had gotten so good at disappearing into the background of his own life that I sometimes wondered if he had opinions at all anymore, buried somewhere under all that silence. And then there was Denise, my younger sister, 44, the golden child, the one who had been beautiful and effortless and adored since the day she was born 3 years after me. Denise had married Rick Bellamy in her 20s, a man who had charmed my parents completely and who had, over the following 2 decades, worked a rotating series of jobs he always described as between opportunities. They had 3 children, Mia, 16, Tyler, 13, and little Sophie, 7. And by the year all of this happened, they were, by any honest accounting, a family in financial freefall. Rick had lost his most recent job at an auto parts distributor 8 months earlier, under circumstances nobody discussed directly, but that I would later learn involved money missing from a register and a very quiet, very convenient resignation instead of charges. Denise worked part-time at a dental office. Between the 2 of them, they were drowning in credit card debt that I would eventually learn totaled just over $22,000, on top of a car loan in default and rent they had not paid in 2 months. I want to be honest with you about something, because honesty is the whole point of telling this story at all. I loved my sister. Underneath every complicated thing between us, I loved her. And I loved those 3 children with an ache that had nothing to do with the way our parents treated us differently. But loving someone and being willing to hand them the deed to your life are 2 very different things, and it took me most of my adult years to understand the difference. Growing up, the pattern had been so consistent it was almost mathematical. Denise got the car for her 16th birthday, a used Honda Civic, and I got a bus pass. Denise's wedding, at 26, cost my parents $18,000, an amount I know precisely because my mother mentioned it at every family gathering for a decade afterward, usually right before reminding me that my own wedding, had I ever had one, would obviously have been smaller, since I never really needed the fuss. I never married. I dated seriously twice, and both times my mother found some quiet way to make the men feel like visitors in a house they would never truly be welcomed into. And both times, eventually, they left. I built a career instead. I built a business, a small but respected practice staging and redesigning homes for sale across central Ohio. The kind of work that requires you to see what a space could become before anyone else can see it. And I built, eventually, a life of my own that I was proud of, quietly, the way you're proud of something you built with your own 2 hands when nobody was helping you carry the boards. My grandmother Dottie was the only person in that family who ever seemed to notice. I was her favorite, and I knew it. And it never once felt like something I stole from anyone, because Dottie's love did not work like my mother's. It was not rationed. Dottie used to say that some children get held up to the light and some children get set down in the corner, and that she had decided, a long time ago, that it was not going to happen to me twice in one lifetime, not in her house. She used to come to my apartment before I bought Birchwood Lane, back when I was renting a cramped one-bedroom above a dry cleaner's, and she would sit at my little kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and tell me that someday I was going to have a house with good bones and better light, and that when I found it, she wanted to help me buy it, no matter what anyone else thought about it. She kept that promise. When she passed, at 83, 3 months after a diagnosis nobody had seen coming, she left me $180,000 from her estate, along with a smaller amount to Denise and a letter. I did not read that letter the day the lawyer handed it to me. I could not. I put it in the fireproof drawer in my home office, sealed, and I did not open it again for almost a decade, because grief has its own timeline, and mine had decided that letter needed to wait. I used the inheritance, along with 9 years of savings from staging and redesigning other people's houses, to buy Birchwood Lane outright. $410,000, closing on a Tuesday in March with rain coming sideways against the windshield of my car. And I remember sitting in the driveway afterward with the keys in my hand, not able to make myself go inside yet, because it felt like something too large to walk into casually. That house became, over the following years, the only place in my life that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. I refinished the floors myself, on my knees for 3 weekends with a rented sander and blistered palms. I tore out a wall between the kitchen and the dining room. I planted a garden in the backyard that Dottie would have loved. Roses along the fence line, the same deep red as the ones she grew behind her own house on Maple Court. Every choice in that house was mine, made without asking anyone's permission. And there is something about a life built that way, quietly, alone, out of your own labor, that other people who have never had to build anything themselves, sometimes cannot see at all. They look at what you built and they see a resource. They do not see the 10 years of blistered hands underneath it. That was the house my mother stood up and gave away at an Easter dinner without asking me a single question first. And Mia, 16-year-old Mia, my niece, sitting there watching me with that careful, searching look. Mia was the one person at that table who I would come to understand, in the months that followed, had already started quietly keeping her own kind of watch on what her grandparents and her own father were planning. She did not say anything that day. She just looked at me, and something passed between us. Something I would not fully understand the shape of until a phone call 4 months later that changed absolutely everything. They had no idea, sitting in that dining room with the ham going cold, what I already had locked in a drawer 11 miles away. And they had even less idea of what they were about to start. The days after that Easter dinner were quiet in the particular way that precedes a storm nobody has named yet. My mother did not call me for 4 days, which was, in itself, its own kind of message, because Linda Winslow did not go quiet unless she was recalibrating a strategy. I spent those 4 days doing the thing I have always done when my family becomes unbearable. I worked. I had 2 houses to stage that week, a colonial in Upper Arlington that needed to look like a family lived a gracious, unhurried life inside it, and a smaller bungalow in Grandview that needed to look bigger than it was. And I threw myself into both projects with the kind of focus that let me not think, for hours at a stretch, about the word easy sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. On the 5th day, my mother called. I almost let it go to voicemail. I did not. "I think we got off on the wrong foot at Easter," she said, in the reasonable, slightly wounded tone she used whenever she wanted to reframe an ambush as a misunderstanding. "I wasn't trying to spring anything on you, Claire. I was trying to include you in a family decision." "It wasn't a decision," I said. "It was an announcement to 22 people about my house." "Your sister is drowning," my mother said, and here her voice sharpened, the reasonableness dropping away like a mask she'd only bothered to half fasten. "Rick lost his job. They're 2 months behind on rent. Do you understand what that means for 3 children? Do you understand what it would do to this family if your sister ended up homeless because her own sister wouldn't share a house that's sitting there with 3 empty bedrooms?" "I understand that Denise and Rick have made choices," I said carefully. "And I understand that I am not responsible for the consequences of those choices." There was a silence on the line. The kind of silence that told me my mother was recalculating. "You've always had it easier than her," she said finally, quietly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. "You never had children. You never had a husband to support. You built a nice little life for yourself with nobody depending on you. And now that we're asking you to open your home for a few months, you're acting like we've asked you to donate a kidney." I closed my eyes. A few months. I had already heard, through the family grapevine, through my Aunt Carol, that a few months in my mother's vocabulary had a way of becoming permanent the moment furniture crossed a threshold. "I'm not doing it, Mom," I said. "You're being selfish," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, performing hurt the way she always did when logic failed her. "And after everything this family has done for you." I did not ask what exactly this family had done for me, because I already knew the conversation would spiral somewhere I did not have the energy to follow that day. I told her I had to get back to a client walkthrough, which was true, and I hung up and I sat in my car outside the Grandview bungalow for a long moment, with my hands still on the wheel, feeling something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some tired, familiar cousin of both. That was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the pressure did not stop. It simply changed shape, the way water finds every gap in a wall it cannot go through directly. My father called me once, which was itself unusual, and in his quiet, apologetic way, he said, "Your mother just wants everyone taken care of, Claire. You know how she gets." He did not ask me to reconsider. He did not ask me anything at all, really. And I understood, the way I had always understood about my father, that he had long ago decided the safest place in any family conflict was directly in the middle of it, saying nothing, offending no one, changing nothing. Denise texted me twice. The first text was almost sweet, a photo of Sophie's drawing of Aunt Claire's pretty house, with a message underneath that said, "We just need a little help. Please think about it." The second text, 10 days later, when I still had not responded the way she wanted, was considerably less sweet. "Must be nice to have so much space you don't even need. Must be nice to never have had to sacrifice anything for anyone." I did not respond to either one for a long time. I sat with them instead, the way you sit with a bruise, pressing on it occasionally, just to measure how much it still hurt. It was Mia who told me, eventually, what was really happening behind the scenes, though it took another 6 weeks before that call came. In the meantime, I want to tell you about the smaller cruelties, because they matter. Because the big betrayal at the center of this story did not arrive out of nowhere. It arrived at the end of a very long hallway lined with small doors, each one a little humiliation I had absorbed and folded neatly away for 30 years. The way you fold laundry you're too tired to think about. There was the Thanksgiving, 11 years earlier, when my mother had introduced me to a visiting cousin as Claire, our career girl. She never quite got around to the family thing. While Denise, 7 months pregnant with Tyler at the time, glowed in the seat beside her like proof of concept. There was the birthday, my 40th, that my mother forgot entirely, calling 2 days late to apologize, explaining that she'd been consumed with planning Sophie's christening, which was, admittedly, a lovely event. The kind of event where I stood in the back of a church holding a gift bag and watching my mother cry happy tears into my father's shoulder over a grandchild she had never cried like that over me for. There was the year I flew home from a work trip in Seattle because Denise had called in a panic about Rick's first job loss, and I sat up with her until 2 in the morning, helping her build a budget spreadsheet on my laptop. And 3 weeks later, my mother told a family friend that I finally started showing up for this family, as though I had not, in fact, been showing up quietly and without credit for 2 decades already. None of these things alone would have been unbearable. It was the accumulation. It was the way each small door opened, revealed the same room behind it, over and over. A room where my needs simply did not register as real, where my life was understood by my family as a kind of holding pattern until it could be made useful to someone else's. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I was not a bitter person walking around waiting for a chance at revenge. I was, if anything, a tired one. I had made a kind of peace with my family's shape a long time ago. The peace you make with weather you cannot change. You learn which coat to wear. You learn which days to stay inside. And you stop expecting the sky to apologize for raining on you. I loved my parents. I loved my sister. I loved my niece and nephew and youngest niece, with a fierceness that had nothing to do with how their household operated. I simply had also learned, slowly and expensively, to keep the most important things about my own life in places my family could not reach. That was why Birchwood Lane mattered so much. That was why, when my mother stood up at that Easter table and gave my house away to a family of 5 without asking me a single question, something in me that had been folding itself smaller for 30 years finally, quietly, refused to fold anymore. But refusal, I would learn very quickly, was not going to be the end of it. My mother did not accept no as an answer from anyone, and she had never, in 69 years, learned to. What I did not yet know, sitting in my staged colonial in Upper Arlington, fluffing throw pillows for a walkthrough, was that somewhere across town, in my parents' kitchen, a different kind of plan was already being quietly discussed. One that did not involve asking me anything at all. It was Mia who called me, on a Tuesday evening in late June, her voice low and fast in the particular way of a teenager who has decided to do something brave and is trying to get through it before her nerve gives out. "Aunt Claire," she said, "I need to tell you something, and you can't tell my mom or Grandma Linda that it was me." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where Dottie used to drink tea with me a decade before I bought this house. "Okay," I said. "I'm listening." "They're not asking anymore," Mia said. "I heard Grandma on the phone with Mom last night. They're not waiting for you to say yes. Grandma said something about how you'd be gone for that work conference in Chicago at the end of July, and how by the time you got back, it would already be, I don't know, she said something about it being easier to ask forgiveness than permission. And Dad's already talked to somebody about renting a moving truck. I remember the exact sensation of that moment, the way the kitchen seemed to tilt very slightly, the way sound narrowed down to just Mia's voice and the low hum of my refrigerator. "They're planning to move in while I'm out of town?" I repeated, needing to hear it in my own voice to believe it. "I think so," Mia said. "I'm sorry. I didn't know if I should tell you, but it felt wrong not to. You've always been nice to me, Aunt Claire. You never make me feel like I have to be a certain way to be worth something." I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up, because it told me something about my niece that broke my heart a little. That she had grown up already fluent in the exact grammar of conditional love that I had spent my whole childhood learning to read. And that she, too, had learned exactly which adults in her life required her to earn her place at the table. They had no idea Mia had called me, and they had absolutely no idea what was already sitting, sealed, in the fireproof drawer in my office. A letter from a woman who had died 11 years earlier, and who had, it turned out, seen this exact moment coming with a clarity that still, to this day, gives me chills. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark of my bedroom on Birchwood Lane, in the house Dottie had helped me buy, listening to the house settle the way old houses do. Little pops and creaks that had always sounded to me like the building breathing. And I thought about locks and lawyers, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally have started treating your life like unclaimed property. Something in me, that night, went very still and very clear. Not angry yet. The anger would come later, cold and organized, the way anger comes to people who have spent their whole lives being told their feelings were an inconvenience. That night, it was something quieter. It was the feeling of a woman finally deciding to stop waiting for her family to see her and starting instead to protect what she had built. I got up at 11 that night, went to my office, and unlocked the fireproof drawer for the first time in almost a decade. Inside was the letter my grandmother Dottie had left me. I had never been ready to read it before. I was ready now. I want to tell you what that letter said, because it is the reason everything that follows in this story happened the way it did, and because I think Dottie, wherever she is, would want it told properly. The envelope was cream-colored, gone slightly soft at the corners from years in the drawer, and my name was written across the front in her looping, old-fashioned hand. Claire, and only Claire. No last name, the way she always wrote it, as though there could be no confusion about which Claire in the world she meant. I sat at my kitchen table, the lamp turned low, and I opened it. "My dearest Claire," it began. "If you are reading this, it means enough time has passed that you finally felt ready. And I want you to know I am proud of you for waiting until you were. Grief does not move on anyone else's schedule, and I never wanted you to feel rushed through yours, not even by me, not even from wherever I am now. I am writing this because I know your family, Claire, better than perhaps even you do, because I raised your mother and I watched the shape her love took as she grew. And I have watched it settle onto you and onto Denise very differently. And I am not writing to relitigate old grievances. I am writing because I want you protected. I set up the trust that helped you buy your house very deliberately and very specifically with the help of Martin Reyes, who was my attorney for the last 20 years of my life and who I trust completely, and who I have asked to continue looking after your interests for as long as you need him. The money I left you was not a loan, and it was not a shared family resource, no matter what anyone tells you later. It was yours, and yours alone, given freely, without condition. And I structured it that way on purpose, because I suspected, and I want to be honest with you, Claire, I more than suspected, I feared that someday someone in this family would try to convince you that what is yours actually belongs to everyone, simply because you built it well enough that other people wanted it. I want to tell you about a day you probably do not even remember, Claire, because you were only 8 years old, and children forget the days that break their grandmother's hearts, even when those days shape them forever. It was the summer your mother repainted your bedroom the same week she repainted Denise's, and she chose a soft yellow for your sister because Denise said yellow made her happy, and she chose a plain, flat white for yours because, and I am quoting her exactly, there was no point spending twice on colors when you would probably grow out of caring. You did not complain. I remember that most of all. You sat on your bare mattress that afternoon, in a room the color of a hospital hallway, and when I asked if you liked it, you told me it was fine. It was practical, and you said it in a voice that was already, at 8 years old, rehearsing how to want less than you were given. I went home that night and I could not sleep. I want you to understand, Claire, that I did not fail to notice these things over the years. I noticed every single one of them. I simply did not always know, at the time, what to do with what I was noticing, because your mother was still my daughter, and some part of me kept believing, for far too long, that the imbalance would correct itself as you both grew older. It never did. If anything, it hardened, the way water hardens into ice when it is left out in weather it was never built to withstand. I want to tell you something else, because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the parts of it that are comfortable to write. In the last year of my life, after the diagnosis, your mother came to see me more often than she had in the previous 5 years combined. I want to be fair to her, Claire, because fairness matters to me even now, even in a letter meant to protect you from her. I do believe some part of her visits came from something real, some genuine fear of losing her own mother, some grief arriving early and looking for somewhere to put itself. But underneath that grief, more and more as the months went on, there was something else, something colder, and I would be lying to you if I pretended I did not see it clearly. The first time she raised the subject, it was gentle, almost apologetic. She sat in the chair beside my bed at the house on Maple Court, in April, and she said she had been thinking about fairness, about how children should be treated equally, about how it might look, to outside eyes, if one granddaughter received so much more than the other. I told her, that day, that fairness and equality are not always the same thing, and that I had given each of my granddaughters exactly what I believed each of them needed, and that this was not a negotiation. She did not raise it again for almost 2 months. The second time, in June, she was less gentle. She brought papers with her, Claire, actual papers, a rough outline she had apparently drafted herself, of how she thought the estate should be divided instead, with Denise's portion increased considerably, and a note at the bottom, in her own handwriting, suggesting that perhaps the house money, as she called it, might be better used as a shared family resource rather than a single inheritance. I did not sign anything. I want you to know that clearly. I sat in my bed, 70 pounds lighter than I had been the year before, exhausted in a way I had never been exhausted in my whole life, and I told my daughter, calmly, that the answer was no, and that I did not wish to discuss it further. The third time was the one that frightened me, Claire, and I do not use that word lightly, not about my own daughter. It was late July, 3 weeks before I died, and I was weaker by then, drifting in and out of long stretches of sleep, and I woke one afternoon to find her sitting beside my bed with a notary she had brought with her, a young man I had never met, holding a folder of documents and looking deeply uncomfortable, as though he understood, even if he would not say so, that something about the situation in that room was not right. Your mother told me it was just a small clarification to my existing paperwork, nothing significant, simply tidying loose ends. I asked to see the documents myself. I read them as carefully as a dying, exhausted woman is able to read anything, and I found, buried in the language, a redirection of a significant portion of your inheritance into a joint account that would have been accessible to your mother directly, structured, on paper, as though it were meant for your benefit but controlled entirely by her. I sent the notary away that afternoon, Claire, and I called Martin the moment they had both left the house. I remember exactly what I said to him, because I have turned the words over in my mind many times since. I told him, "Martin, my daughter is trying to take something from my granddaughter while I am still breathing in this bed, and I need you to make certain she cannot try again after I am not." Martin came to see me the following morning, and we spent 4 hours together building what eventually became the clause I have already described to you, and several others besides, layered carefully enough that no single loophole could undo them all at once. I want you to know, Claire, that building that protection was not the last thing I did out of anger. It was, I think, the last important thing I did out of love. And I want those two feelings kept separate in your mind, because they are not the same thing, even when they arrive at the same solution. There is a lighter memory I want to leave you with, too, because I do not want this letter to be only grief and legal maneuvering, though I suppose both of those things are, in their own way, forms of love as well. I want to tell you about a 4th of July, 6 years before I died, at the lake house, when you were still in your 30s and Denise's oldest, little Mia, was barely 5. Everyone else had gone down to the dock to watch the fireworks that the Hendersons, 2 houses over, always set off every year. Far too many of them, far too close to the water. And you had stayed behind on the porch with me, because my hip was bad that summer and I could not manage the gravel path in the dark. Mia had stayed too, Claire. Do you remember that? She was 5 years old, and everyone had gone to see the fireworks, and she chose, on her own, without anyone telling her to stay on the porch with the 2 of us instead. And she climbed up into your lap and fell asleep there before the first firework even went off. And you sat very still for almost an hour so you would not wake her, watching the light flash white and gold over the water through the screen. I remember thinking, that night, watching you hold that child so carefully, so entirely without needing anyone to see you do it or thank you for it, that whatever your mother had decided you were, whatever role she had assigned you in this family, she was wrong. And she would likely go on being wrong for the rest of her life, because people rarely revise a story once they have found it convenient. I thought, that night, that Mia already understood something about you that the rest of the family had somehow trained themselves not to see. Children have a way of knowing where the real safety in a room is located, Claire, even when the adults around them have all agreed to look somewhere else. I do not know, writing this now, whether that little girl will have grown into someone who remembers that night, or into someone who has simply absorbed the family's habits the way water takes the shape of whatever container it is poured into. I hope, whatever has happened by the time you read this, that she is still the child who stayed on the porch. I suspect, knowing her small, watchful nature even at 5 years old, that she is exactly that kind of person still. And if she is, Claire, I want you to let her close, whatever else has happened around you both. Loyalty like that is rarer in this family than anyone in it has ever been willing to admit. And it deserves to be recognized when it shows itself, especially if it shows itself quietly, the way yours always has. I also want to address the money itself directly, because I think specifics matter more than sentiment when it comes to protecting yourself later. The full estate, after the lake property and a smaller bequest to Denise, totaled just under $240,000. Of that, $180,000 was designated for you, structured as an irrevocable trust distribution rather than a simple inheritance, specifically so that it could not later be reclassified, redirected, or clawed back through any family agreement, court challenge, or persuasive argument delivered at a kitchen table. Martin has copies of every document. He has had them for 11 years, waiting, the way I asked him to wait, for the day you might need them. I chose $180,000 deliberately, Claire. Not simply because it was what remained after other bequests, but because I wanted it to be enough. Enough for a home. Enough that you would never again have to build your safety entirely out of your own labor alone, the way you had been doing since you were far too young to have been doing it by yourself in the first place. I wanted you to have, once in your life, something given to you freely, without a string attached to the giving, because I do not believe you had ever once, before that money arrived, been given anything in this family without a condition folded quietly inside it. If that day has come, I want you to know two things. First, that you are under no obligation, moral or otherwise, to hand over what you built with your own hands to anyone who did not build it alongside you. Love is not a lien. Kinship is not a claim on your address. Second, and I want you to read this part carefully, Claire, because it matters. The trust I established, the one that funded your inheritance, contains a clause Martin and I drafted together very specifically. If any family member ever attempts to coerce, pressure, or take legal action to claim any portion of what was left to you individually, including, specifically, real property purchased with those funds, that family member forfeits any remaining claim to my estate, including the shared lake property on Kelly's Island, which, as you know, remains jointly held by the family and which your mother, in particular, has always loved very much. I did not do this to punish anyone, Claire. I did this because I watched, for 83 years, the way people who assume too much about a family's love often end up finding out too late how conditional their own behavior has made it. I wanted you to have a shield, in case you ever needed one, that did not require you to raise your voice or defend yourself at all. I wanted the shield to simply exist, quietly, until the day it was needed. I love you, Claire. I loved watching you build a life with your own two hands, a life nobody handed you, and nobody can take from you either, not while I have anything to say about it, even now. Whatever is happening when you finally read this, I want you to remember that you do not owe anyone your foundation. You are allowed to be the floor other people stand on your entire life. Or you are allowed to simply be a woman standing on her own. All my love, always, Dottie. I read that letter 4 times before I set it down on the table and simply sat there, in the lamplight, with my hands pressed flat against the wood, feeling something enormous and complicated move through my chest. Grief, mostly, sharp and sudden, missing her in a way I had not let myself miss her in years. But underneath the grief, something else. Something that felt almost like being handed a key to a door I had not known existed. My grandmother had seen this coming. 11 years before my mother stood up at an Easter table and gave my house away to a family of 5, Dottie had already built a wall around it, brick by legal brick, with a lawyer named Martin Reyes, specifically to protect me from exactly this moment. I did not cry for long. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I let myself feel the grief, fully, for about 10 minutes, and then something in me went quiet and clear in the way water goes still right before it freezes. I picked up my phone. It was nearly midnight, but I opened my contacts anyway, and I found the entry I had saved years ago and never once used. Martin Reyes, attorney, Dottie's lawyer. And I typed out a short message asking if he could meet with me as soon as possible, that it was important, that it involved my grandmother's trust. He wrote back within the hour, which told me something about the kind of man he was, and about the kind of promise he had apparently made to a client who had been gone 11 years and whom he clearly still considered himself bound to. "Of course, Claire," he wrote. "Dottie told me this day might come. I've actually been keeping a file ready for exactly this conversation. Can you come Thursday at 9? I sat back in my chair and looked at that message for a long time. They had no idea, none of them, that the plan they thought they were quietly assembling, the moving truck, the timing around my Chicago trip, the assumption that possession would simply become fact before I could object, had already been anticipated in exact and loving detail by a woman who had died over a decade earlier and had loved me enough to build a trap not for me, but for anyone foolish enough to come for what was mine. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them on Thursday morning in a law office on High Street. And neither, if I am honest, did I fully understand yet just how deep Dottie's foresight had gone. Because what Martin Reyes was about to show me went far beyond a single protective clause, and it was going to change everything about how I walked into the following 6 weeks. Martin Reyes's office was on the 4th floor of a converted brick building on High Street, the kind of office with tall windows and a lot of law books that looked like they were actually used rather than decorative. And Martin himself turned out to be a trim, silver-haired man in his early 70s, with reading glasses pushed up into his hair, and a manner that was warm without being soft, precise without being cold. "Your grandmother," he said, settling into the chair across from me with a thick manila folder already open on his desk, "was one of the sharpest clients I ever had, and I want you to understand that before we go any further. Everyone underestimated Dottie Callahan her whole life. She used that. She used it very deliberately and very well." "She told me she suspected something like this would happen," I said. "The letter, I mean. She said she more than suspected." Martin nodded slowly. "She did more than suspect, Claire. In the last year of her life, your mother came to her, more than once, asking Dottie to reconsider how the estate was divided. Your mother felt, and I'm quoting directly from my notes here, that it was, quote, unfair for Claire to receive so much when Denise had a family to think about." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. My mother tried to get her to change it, before she died. "She tried 3 times that I'm aware of," Martin said, "and each time Dottie refused, and each time your mother pushed harder. The 3rd attempt, about 4 months before your grandmother passed, was serious enough that Dottie called me directly, quite upset, and asked me to draft additional protective language into the trust. That's the clause you read in the letter, the forfeiture clause tied to the Kelly's Island property." I sat back in my chair, absorbing this. My mother had tried, while Dottie was still alive and dying, to redirect an inheritance that was not hers to redirect. And Dottie, rather than simply refusing quietly, had gone further. She had built a structure specifically designed to punish exactly the behavior my mother was now, 11 years later, apparently still willing to engage in. "There's something else," Martin said, and he slid a second document across the desk toward me. "Your grandmother left a standing instruction with my office. If any attempt was ever made, coercion, legal action, even something as simple as unauthorized occupancy, to claim property purchased with her bequest to you, I was to immediately file for a formal declaration of title on your behalf, at no cost to you, drawn from a small retainer she left specifically for this purpose. She called it, and I remember this phrase exactly because it struck me at the time, her insurance policy against being underestimated twice. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. She really thought of everything. She really did, Martin said, and something in his expression softened. I want to be straightforward with you, Claire, because I think you deserve straightforward counsel here, not just legal comfort. The house on Birchwood Lane is yours, solely and completely. It is titled in your name alone. No family member has any legal claim to it whatsoever, and nothing your mother says at a dinner table changes that in the slightest. If your family attempts to occupy that property without your consent, and from what you've told me about this planned moving truck, that is precisely what's being discussed, that would constitute, at minimum, trespass, and potentially, depending on how it unfolds, unlawful entry. And if they claim I agreed to it? If they say I said yes and changed my mind? Martin's expression turned faintly grim. Then we would be very glad you came to see me today, because we are going to make absolutely certain there is no ambiguity whatsoever about what you did and did not agree to. Over the next hour, Martin and I built what he called, with a small, dry smile, a paper trail nobody could argue with. He drafted a formal letter, to be sent by certified mail to both my mother and my sister, stating clearly and unambiguously that I had not consented, did not consent, and would not consent to any family member occupying the property at 1421 Birchwood Lane, and that any attempt to do so would be treated as trespass and responded to accordingly. He advised me to document, in writing, every conversation going forward. Texts, emails, anything in my mother's or sister's own words that confirmed they understood my refusal and intended to proceed regardless. People like your mother, Martin said, closing the folder at last, tend to believe that persistence eventually becomes consent. It doesn't. It never has, legally or otherwise. But we're going to make sure that if this ends up anywhere formal, and Claire, I want you prepared for the possibility that it might, there is no question, anywhere, about what actually happened here. I left his office that Thursday morning with a folder of my own, copies of everything, and a feeling I had not had in longer than I could remember. The feeling of standing on ground that was actually solid beneath me, rather than land I had to keep proving I deserved to stand on. What I did not yet know, walking out onto High Street into the July sunlight, was just how far my mother and sister were prepared to go, or how many people they were prepared to pull into their version of events before this was over. The moving truck had already been reserved. For the Saturday I would be in Chicago. What I also did not know yet was that Mia, quietly, on her own, had already started keeping a small private record of her own. Screenshots, overheard conversations, dates. Because some part of my 16-year-old niece had apparently already decided, without anyone asking her to, that the truth in this family was going to need a witness. They had no idea any of this was happening, and they were about to find out, all at once, in a single Saturday afternoon that none of them would ever forget. The 6 weeks between that meeting with Martin and the Saturday everything came to a head were, on the surface, almost eerily calm. My mother did not call to press me further, which in hindsight should have told me something. Linda Winslow rarely retreated from a fight she had not already secretly won in her own mind. Denise's texts grew less frequent, then stopped altogether, replaced by an odd, performative cheerfulness whenever we happened to speak, as though she already knew something I did not and was simply waiting for the reveal. I used that quiet, unnervingly, to prepare. I want to walk you through what those 6 weeks actually looked like, because I think there is a temptation, in stories like this, to skip straight to the confrontation, to the big, dramatic scene. And I understand that temptation, but the truth is that the confrontation was not the important part. The important part was everything I did quietly in the weeks before it, because that is where the actual power in this story was built. Not in a single dramatic sentence delivered at the right moment, but in a folder, in a series of documented conversations, in a locksmith's invoice, in the patient, unglamorous work of making sure that when the moment finally came, there would be no ambiguity left for anyone to hide inside. The first thing I did was change the locks. I called a locksmith the same week I met with Martin, a man named Pete who ran a small shop 2 towns over and who asked no questions beyond what kind of deadbolt I preferred. And I had every exterior lock on Birchwood Lane rekeyed within 4 days. I also had a small security camera system installed. 2 cameras, one covering the front porch and driveway, one covering the back door, feeding to an app on my phone that would alert me the instant anyone approached the house. It cost me $640, an amount I remember precisely because I wrote it down in the same folder where I was keeping everything else. Under a tab Martin had suggested I label simply documentation. The second thing I did was send the certified letter Martin had drafted. I want to describe the moment I mailed it, because it felt, at the time, disproportionately significant for something so small. A plain white envelope, dropped into the blue mailbox outside the post office on a Tuesday afternoon, addressed to my mother and separately to Denise. Inside was a single page stating, in the calm, immovable language of an attorney, that I had not consented to any family member occupying my property, that I did not consent now, and that any attempt to do so would be treated as trespass under Ohio law. My mother called me the day after she received it. I let it go to voicemail. Her message, which I still have saved, has stayed with me in a way that surprised me even then. "Claire," she said, and her voice on that voicemail had none of the wounded softness from our earlier phone call. It was flat and cold and unmistakably furious. "I don't know what kind of lawyer nonsense you think you're playing at, but I want you to understand something. This family does not send each other legal letters. This family takes care of each other. You have clearly forgotten which one you're a part of, and I think it's time somebody reminded you." I saved that voicemail into the folder too. Martin had told me to save everything, and I did, methodically, the way I imagine a person catalogs evidence of a slow-motion collision they can see coming and cannot stop. Only in this case, I could stop it, and I fully intended to. There was a night, about 2 weeks into that quiet stretch, when I almost talked myself out of all of it. I want to be honest about that moment, because I think it matters, and because I do not believe any of this would feel true if I pretended I moved through those 6 weeks with nothing but cold, unwavering resolve. It was a Tuesday, close to 11 at night, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, the certified letter's return receipt paper-clipped to the front, my mother's voicemail transcribed in my own handwriting on a legal pad beside it, and I remember looking at all of it spread out under the lamp and thinking, quite suddenly, that I had become someone I did not entirely recognize. I thought about calling my mother and simply apologizing, letting Denise's family stay for a few months, absorbing it the way I had absorbed everything else for 30 years. Because some tired, familiar part of me still believed, even then, that peace bought with my own discomfort was cheaper than the alternative. I sat with that thought for a long time. I let myself feel the pull of it, the old gravity of it. Because I think it is important to admit that boundaries are not maintained by feeling strong every single day. They are maintained by choosing, again and again, on the nights when you do not feel strong at all, to stay the course anyway. What pulled me back that night was rereading Dottie's letter for the 5th time, my finger tracing the line about the floor other people stand on. And something in me finally understood the difference between generosity and self-erasure, a difference I had spent decades blurring together without meaning to. Generosity is a gift you choose to give from a place of surplus. Self-erasure is a debt you pay because you have been convinced, since childhood, that your own needs were never quite legitimate enough to count as a real expense. I closed the folder that night, made myself a cup of tea, and went to bed without making the call. The following morning, Denise called me, and I want to describe that conversation carefully because it is one of the clearest examples I have of exactly how much my sister did not yet understand about what was coming. "Hey, stranger," she said, breezy, warm, as though the previous months of tension had simply evaporated. "I feel like we haven't talked in forever. How's work?" "Busy," I said carefully, "staging 2 houses this week." "That's so great," Denise said, and I could hear, underneath the brightness, something calculated, a woman testing the temperature of water before deciding whether to step further in. "Listen, I wanted to just check in. Things have been kind of stressful here with Rick's job situation and everything, but honestly, I feel so much better knowing it's all going to work out soon. Mom's been amazing, really stepping up to help us figure things out." "Has she?" I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, the way Martin had coached me, giving away nothing. "She really has," Denise said. "I know things got weird at Easter, and I'm sorry if that felt like an ambush, but honestly, Claire, once you see how much easier it'll be with a little more space, I really think you'll be glad we worked it out. The kids are so excited. Sophie keeps asking about the backyard." I sat very still at my kitchen table, phone pressed to my ear, absorbing the fact that my sister was speaking to me as though the plan were already settled, already agreed to, already simply a matter of scheduling rather than consent. I did not correct her. Martin had told me explicitly not to reveal anything about the locks, the cameras, or the letter's legal weight in casual conversation, because the value of silence, he said, was that it let people keep building on a foundation that was no longer there, so that when it finally gave way beneath them, they would have no one to blame but their own certainty. "I hope things get easier for you all," I said, which was true, and which was also, I realized as I said it, the last entirely honest thing I would say to my sister for several more weeks. After we hung up, I wrote the conversation down in the folder, word for word, as close as I could remember it, with the date and time at the top. Martin had asked me to do this every time, and at first it had felt strange, almost paranoid, transcribing my own sister's voice like a deposition. But sitting there that morning, rereading Denise's words on the page, I understood exactly why he had asked. Written down, stripped of her warm, breezy tone, the conversation read very differently. It read like a woman confirming, calmly and without a flicker of doubt, that she expected to move her family into a house that was not hers, on a timeline that had already been set without my agreement, because somewhere along the way, our whole family had collectively decided my consent was a formality rather than a requirement. I called Martin later that week, mostly to ask a technical question about how long the documentation needed to be before it held up cleanly if anything escalated. But the conversation ended up going somewhere more useful than I expected. "You're doing exactly the right thing," he told me. "But I want to give you one more piece of advice, and I want you to actually use it, not just hear it and set it aside. Start keeping a simple written log, dated, of your own state of mind through all this. Not for a court, necessarily, for yourself. People in your position, Claire, sometimes spend so much energy proving the facts of what happened that they forget to document what it cost them to survive it. That record matters too, even if no judge ever reads it. I started that log that same night, a plain composition notebook I kept in the drawer beside my bed, and I want to share a little of what I wrote in it, because I think it captures something the folder full of legal documents could not. August the 3rd, I wrote. I am so tired of being calm. I want, for 1 hour, to be as loud and as certain as my mother is, without anyone calling it dramatic. I am choosing to stay calm anyway, because I think calm is the only language this family has ever had to be forced to actually listen to. August the 9th, I wrote, after a call with my father that had left me strangely hollow. Dad asked if I was doing okay. He has never asked me that in my whole adult life. I don't know what to do with the fact that it took an almost eviction of myself from my own house for him to finally ask. August the 14th. Mia sent me a screenshot tonight of a text thread between Mom and Denise, planning which of Sophie's toys would fit in the back bedroom closet. They are choosing curtains for a room in my house. I sat on my bathroom floor for 20 minutes after I read it. Then I got up, made dinner, and kept going. I include those entries because I think it is easy, listening to a story like this one after the fact, to imagine the person at the center of it as someone armored the entire way through, unbothered, coolly assembling her evidence like a woman playing chess, rather than a woman whose own mother and sister were, in fact, actively trying to take something from her. That was never the truth of it. I was frightened, more nights than I want to admit. I was lonely in a specific and unglamorous way, the loneliness of being surrounded by an entire extended family and still feeling as though not one of them, aside from a 16-year-old girl and a woman I had never been especially close to, actually saw what was happening to me clearly. It was around this same time, in the second week of August, that I finally told my 2 closest friends outside the family what was going on. I had kept it mostly to myself until then, partly out of habit and partly, I think, out of a lingering, irrational embarrassment. The particular shame of admitting that your own mother is capable of something like this. My friend Renata, who I had known since design school, listened to the entire story over coffee one Saturday morning, with an expression that moved steadily from disbelief into something closer to fury. Claire, she said when I finished, you understand this is not normal, right? I need you to actually hear that. This is not a family disagreement. This is your mother and your sister trying to take your house. I remember laughing, a short, humorless laugh, because something about hearing it stated so plainly by someone entirely outside the tangled logic of my family made the whole situation suddenly, almost comically clear. Of course it was not normal. I had simply spent so long inside the specific weather system of my own family that I had lost the ability to judge the temperature from outside it. Renata became, in her own quiet way, another piece of the foundation I was building that summer. Not because she had any legal or financial role in what came next, but because she gave me somewhere to put the parts of the story that were simply too heavy to carry alone. We had dinner twice a week through the rest of August, and each time she asked me the same question before we talked about anything else. How are you actually doing? Not how are you handling it? I did not always have a good answer. I always appreciated being asked. By the middle of August, the folder Martin and I had started was already thick enough that I had begun organizing it into labeled sections: correspondence, financial notes, the transcribed calls, the notebook entries, copies of Dottie's letter and trust paperwork. And I remember sitting with it spread across my dining room table one evening, looking at the sheer volume of what I had assembled in less than 2 months, and feeling something shift permanently in how I understood myself. I was not simply enduring my family anymore. I was, for the first time in my life, building a case for my own worth, in writing, with dates and signatures, because I had finally accepted that no one inside that family was going to build it for me. The third thing I did, and this is the part I think mattered most in the end, was reach out to my Aunt Carol. Carol was my mother's younger sister by 4 years, a retired nurse who had spent most of her adult life a careful, diplomatic distance from the center of my mother's orbit, close enough to remain part of the family, far enough to have kept, I think, a clearer view of it than most of us. I had never been especially close to Carol growing up, not the way I had been close to Dottie, but something in the last several years, maybe watching my own mother, maybe simply getting older, had shifted the way Carol and I related to each other. And when I called her that July and told her, carefully, what had happened at Easter and what I now understood was being planned, she was quiet for a long moment on the phone. "I wondered when this was going to happen," Carol said finally. "Your mother tried something similar with me once, you know. Years ago, when our own mother, your grandmother on my side, not Dottie, I mean my mother, was declining. Linda tried to get power of attorney redirected in a way that would have benefited her more than it should have. I fought her on it. We didn't speak for almost 2 years afterward. I had never known this. It rearranged, slightly, the whole shape of how I understood my mother. Not as a woman uniquely fixated on my house, but as a woman with a long, consistent pattern of believing that other people's resources existed, ultimately, for her to redistribute according to her own sense of fairness. "I'll help you however I can," Carol said. "And Claire, if this comes to a family confrontation, which I suspect it will, I want to be there. Someone in that family needs to be standing next to you instead of behind Linda for once." I cried a little after that call, quietly at my kitchen table. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, disorienting relief of being believed by someone who had lived inside the same family and had somehow, independently, arrived at the same conclusions I had. The fourth thing I did, in the final 2 weeks before my scheduled trip to Chicago, was quietly gather what I could about Rick. I did not go looking for this information out of vindictiveness. It found me, mostly, through Mia, who had continued, cautiously, to keep me updated, and through a conversation I had, almost by accident, with a woman named Sherry who used to work with Rick at the auto parts distributor, and who I ran into at a client's open house, of all places, staging furniture in a living room 3 streets over from where Rick and Denise used to live before their most recent move. Sherry, making small talk while she waited for her own realtor, mentioned Rick's name, and something in my face must have shifted because she lowered her voice and said, "Careful. Are you close with him?" And when I said, carefully, "He's my brother-in-law," she told me, in the hushed, slightly guilty tone of someone sharing something she probably shouldn't, that Rick had not simply lost his job 8 months earlier. He had been let go after an internal investigation found nearly $4,000 missing from register deposits over several months, and the company had chosen not to press charges only because Rick had agreed, quietly, to repay it and resign immediately. I did not know, in that moment in the open house, exactly what I would do with that information, if anything. I only knew, standing there with a throw pillow still in my hand, that the picture of my sister's household was considerably more precarious than the story my mother had been telling at family dinners. A story about a hard-working, unlucky family who simply needed a helping hand, rather than a household built, at least in part, on debt, deception, and a husband who had already shown, at least once, that he was willing to take what was not his when he thought no one would notice. I wrote it down in the folder under documentation, with the date and Sherry's first name and the general nature of what she'd told me. Not because I intended to weaponize gossip, but because Martin had told me, plainly, that if this situation ever escalated into something formal, and by late July it was becoming clear that it might, every piece of context mattered. The fifth thing I did, 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for Chicago, was call Martin one last time and ask him a question that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. "If they do it," I said, "if they show up with that truck while I'm gone, what actually happens?" Martin was quiet for a moment. "Legally, Claire, you have every protection in the world. Practically, I want you to consider something. Sometimes the strongest version of justice isn't the one that happens quietly, behind the scenes, weeks later in a courtroom nobody in your family will ever see. Sometimes it's the one that happens in front of the people who need to witness it, so that nobody in this family can ever again pretend the truth was ambiguous." I understood then what he was suggesting, and something in me, something that had spent 30 years avoiding exactly this kind of visibility, went very still, and then, slowly, agreed. "I don't want to go to Chicago," I said. "I don't think you should," Martin said. "I think you should let them believe you have. And I think when that truck arrives, you should be standing on your own porch waiting for it." They had no idea, none of them, that the trap had already closed weeks earlier, quietly, patiently, built out of a fireproof drawer and a lawyer's retainer and a 16-year-old girl's quiet loyalty. All that remained now was the day itself. And that day, as it turned out, arrived faster than any of us expected. I told my mother, in a short, deliberately neutral text, that I was leaving for my Chicago conference on Thursday and would be back the following Wednesday. This was, of course, a lie, but it was a lie constructed entirely out of information I had already given them weeks earlier, unprompted, back before any of this had started, when my travel schedule had simply been a fact of my life, rather than a piece of a strategy. I did not need to invent anything. I only needed to let a truth I had already told become the exact shape of the trap. I packed a suitcase, visibly, and left it by my front door for 2 days, in case anyone drove by, which, I would later learn from Mia, my mother did, twice, slowing her car in front of Birchwood Lane like a scout confirming a target was still undefended. On Thursday morning, I drove to the airport, parked in the long-term garage, and took a rideshare directly to my Aunt Carol's house on the other side of town, where I stayed, quietly, for 4 days, working remotely, watching my camera app obsessively, and waiting. Mia texted me updates almost daily. Grandma and Mom talked to a moving company. Dad rented a truck for Saturday. They keep saying, by the time she's back, it'll already be done and she won't want to make a scene. I read that last message probably a dozen times, sitting on Carol's guest bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, feeling something in my chest that was equal parts fury and, strangely, a kind of grim, sad clarity. My own mother was operating on the explicit assumption that I would rather absorb harm quietly than create a scene defending myself. She had built an entire plan on the foundation of who she believed I was. She had no idea that woman did not exist anymore. Or perhaps, more accurately, she had no idea that woman had never fully existed in the first place, that I had simply, for 30 years, made the strategic decision to let her believe I did, because the cost of proving otherwise had always seemed higher than the cost of staying quiet. That cost had just changed. And on Saturday morning, at 9:47, according to my camera app's timestamp, a white rental moving truck turned slowly onto Birchwood Lane, and everything my family thought they understood about me was about to be tested against everything I had spent 6 weeks quietly building. Saturday arrived warm and overcast, the kind of flat gray Ohio summer morning that makes everything feel slightly suspended. And I remember standing in my Aunt Carol's kitchen at 7 that morning, drinking coffee I could not taste, watching my phone, waiting. Martin had advised me not to confront the truck the instant it arrived. "Let them start," he said, during our final call the night before. "Let them get out of the truck. Let them start carrying things toward the door. I want whatever happens documented as clearly as possible, and the clearest version of that story is the one where they are already mid-action when you arrive, not the one where you're standing there accusing them before they've done anything at all." So I waited, watching the little rectangle of my phone screen, watching the empty porch and driveway feed from my camera app, my stomach in a slow, tight knot, until at 9:47 that white truck rolled into frame, and behind it, Rick's gray pickup, and behind that, my mother's silver sedan. I watched them get out. I watched Rick walk around to the truck's rear door and unlatch it. I watched Denise stand on my front porch, my front porch, with Sophie's hand in hers, and Tyler trailing behind carrying a cardboard box. And I watched my mother, in a crisp white blouse, walk up to my front door with the particular brisk confidence of a woman who has never once in her entire life doubted her right to be somewhere. I watched her try the door handle. I watched it not open, because Pete the locksmith had rekeyed every lock on that house 6 weeks earlier. And I watched my mother's face, even through the slightly grainy resolution of a $200 camera, shift from confidence into confusion into something sharper. I got in my car. Carol came with me, at her own insistence, sitting in the passenger seat with her purse in her lap and her jaw set in a way I had never seen on my gentle, diplomatic aunt before. "I've been waiting a long time to watch your mother's plans fall apart in front of her," Carol said, quietly, as we pulled out of her driveway. "I'm sorry it has to be like this, but I'm glad I get to be here." The drive to Birchwood Lane took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time, unable to look away from it, the way you cannot look away from a countdown even when you already know exactly what number it will end on. When I turned onto my own street, I could see them from half a block away. The truck's rear door open, boxes stacked on the sidewalk, my mother standing at the front door still working the handle, Rick standing near the truck with his hands on his hips, looking up at the house the way a man looks at something he has already, in his mind, begun redecorating. I parked directly behind the moving truck, blocking it in. I sat in the car for exactly 3 seconds before getting out, and in those 3 seconds, I thought about my grandmother's letter, about the word shield, about 30 years of small doors each opening onto the same room. And something in me settled into a kind of calm I had never had access to before in my entire relationship with this family. I got out of the car. My mother turned first. I watched her face do something complicated. Surprise, then a flicker of something like panic, quickly smoothed over into the same brisk confidence from a moment before, as though she could simply talk her way past what was happening in front of her. "Claire," she said, "you're supposed to be in Chicago." "I know," I said. "I decided to come home early." Denise had gone very still on the porch, Sophie's hand still in hers, and I could see her calculating, the way she always calculated in moments like this, trying to figure out which version of events might still let her win. Rick had not moved from beside the truck, his expression somewhere between defiant and, underneath it, unmistakably nervous. Carol stepped out of the car behind me, slower, more deliberate, closing her door with a quiet, controlled click that felt, in that moment, louder than a slam. She did not come to stand beside me right away. She stood a few feet back, near the hood of my car, her phone already lifted, already recording, her expression unreadable in the flat, gray morning light. I noticed, in the strange, expanded way you notice small details in the seconds before something enormous happens, that Mia was standing near the back of her father's truck, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching everyone else on that sidewalk with the careful, unreadable stillness of a girl who already knew far more than the adults around her assumed she did. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and the faint diesel tang of the idling truck, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking, and the whole scene had the strange, suspended quality of a photograph that had not yet decided what it was going to become. Nobody moved for a moment. The boxes sat stacked on the sidewalk, damp along their bottom edges from the wet grass beneath them. Sophie shifted from foot to foot on the porch, humming something tuneless under her breath, too young to understand that the ground beneath the whole family had just started quietly to shift. I looked at my mother, standing at my own front door in her crisp white blouse, one hand still resting uselessly on a door handle that would never again open for her without my permission. And I felt something in my chest settle into a kind of stillness I did not entirely recognize as belonging to me. It was not anger, not yet, not the way I had always imagined anger would feel if I ever finally let myself have it in front of her. It was closer to clarity, the particular, weightless clarity of a woman who has spent 30 years rehearsing a conversation in her head and has finally, unexpectedly, arrived at the moment to have it out loud. "Claire," my mother said again, when I did not speak right away, and I could hear her recalibrating in real time, searching for the version of her voice that had always worked on me before, wounded, reasonable, faintly disappointed. "I think we need to talk about this like adults." "I agree," I said. "That's exactly what I intend to do." Something in my calm seemed to unsettle her more than if I had shouted. I watched her eyes flick, briefly, toward Carol's raised phone, toward the neighbor 2 doors down who had come out onto her own porch at the sound of voices, and now stood there frankly watching, arms folded, making no effort to pretend she was doing anything else. My mother had built her entire life around controlling the story other people told about her family. Standing on that sidewalk, she was watching, for the first time I could remember, a version of that story begin to assemble itself entirely outside of her hands. "This isn't what it looks like," my mother said. "It looks like you're moving Denise's family into my house without my permission," I said, and my voice came out level, almost conversational, the exact tone Martin and I had practiced for this moment. "Using a key that doesn't exist anymore, on a day you thought I'd be 400 miles away. So I think it's exactly what it looks like." "We tried to talk to you," my mother said, her voice climbing. "We tried for months, Claire, and you just kept saying no, 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 like a spoiled child. And eventually a family has to just take care of itself. You've always been the easy one. I thought, at the very least, you'd come home and see it was already done and let it go, rather than make a whole scene about it." There it was again, the easy one. I let the phrase sit in the air for a moment, between us, on the sidewalk, in front of the open truck and the stacked boxes and my sister's frozen face on the porch. "I've heard you say that about me my whole life," I said. "The easy one. I used to think it was a compliment. It took me a long time to understand it was never about me being easy. It was about you assuming I would always absorb whatever this family decided to do to me, because I'd never once made you pay a price for it. Claire, my mother started. I'm not finished, I said quietly, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I expected, because she actually stopped talking, for perhaps the first time in my adult life. You tried to get Grandma Dottie to change her will before she died, so that less of it would come to me. Did you know I found that out? You tried 3 times. She refused you 3 times, and the 3rd time, she was so unsettled by how far you'd push that she had her lawyer build a clause into her trust specifically to protect me from exactly this moment. This one, right here. My mother's face had gone pale, a genuine, uncontrolled paleness that had nothing to do with performance. That's not... Dottie wouldn't have told you that, she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. She didn't, I said. Her lawyer did, because she left instructions for exactly this scenario. Mom, if you or Denise had continued today, if that truck had actually unloaded into a house you don't own, using a key that no longer works, you would have triggered a clause that forfeits your claim to the Kelly's Island property. The lake house, the one you've told me 100 times is the only thing you have left of her that actually matters to you. I watched the exact moment the information landed. I watched my mother's face crumble, not gracefully, not with dignity, but the way ice crumbles when you finally strike the one weak point that was holding the whole surface together. You're lying, she said, but it came out thin, almost pleading. I'm not, I said. Call Martin Reyes yourself if you don't believe me. His number hasn't changed in 20 years. He has the documents. He's had them since before Grandma died. Rick, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke, his voice too loud, too aggressive, the voice of a man trying to reassert control over a situation that had clearly already left his hands. This is ridiculous. We're not thieves, we're family, and family doesn't need a permission slip to help each other. Rick, I said, turning toward him, and something in my calm must have unsettled him more than shouting would have, because he actually took a half-step back. I know about the $4,000 missing from your register deposits at the auto parts store. I know that's the real reason you left, not a layoff. I know your family isn't drowning because of bad luck. I know it's drowning, at least in part, because of choices you made and hid from everyone, including your own wife, until she had no choice but to go along with whatever story made it easiest to keep asking for help. Denise's head snapped toward her husband on the porch, and in her face I watched something shift. Not disbelief, which would have been almost a relief, but recognition. The look of a woman confirming something she had already, quietly, suspected. Is that true? She asked him, and her voice had gone very small. Rick did not answer. He looked at the ground, then at the truck, then at nothing at all. And in his silence, every version of the story he had been telling for 8 months collapsed at once. They had no idea, standing on that sidewalk, that I had spent 6 weeks assembling every piece of this. And they had absolutely no idea that Carol, standing quietly beside me with her arms crossed, had brought her phone, and had been recording the entire conversation from the moment we stepped out of the car. For a long moment, nobody on that sidewalk said anything at all. Sophie, 7 years old and entirely unaware of the weight of what was happening around her, tugged on Denise's hand and asked, in the small, clear voice of a child noticing only the surface of things, "Mommy, are we still moving into Aunt Claire's house? Can I have the room with the window seat?" Denise made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and crouched down to Sophie's level, and I watched my sister's face, for just a moment, become something almost unbearably young and lost. The same face she used to make as a little girl when a plan she had trusted completely started falling apart around her. "No, baby," Denise said quietly. "I don't think we are." My mother was still standing at the front door, one hand still resting on the useless door handle, and I watched her try, one more time, to reassemble her authority. "This is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction I would expect," she said. But her voice had lost its conviction entirely, the words coming out more like habit than belief. "You've clearly been planning this, recording us, involving lawyers, over a house. Do you understand how that looks, Claire? Do you understand what people are going to think of you?" "I think," I said, "people are going to think exactly what happened. That my mother tried to move my sister's family into my house without asking me, using a key that no longer worked, on a day she thought I'd be out of town, and that when I came home and stopped her, she called it dramatic." Carol, beside me, finally spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. "Linda," she said, and her voice carried a quiet, terrible calm of its own, the calm of a younger sister who had waited a very long time to say something out loud. "I watched you do this to me, over Mom, 15 years ago. I let it go, because I didn't want the family split over it forever. I'm not going to let you do it to Claire and pretend it's the first time you've ever tried something like this." My mother's face, at that, did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It went blank. Not calm, not composed. Simply blank. The particular blankness of a person who has just realized that the version of the story they've been telling themselves for years is not the version anyone else actually believes anymore. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. The truck sat open behind us, boxes stacked uselessly on the sidewalk. A neighbor 2 doors down had come out onto her porch, drawn by the raised voices, and stood there, arms crossed, watching. And I remember thinking, distantly, that this too was part of what Martin had meant when he talked about visibility. That some truths only become undeniable once someone outside the family is standing there watching them unfold. It was Mia who finally broke the silence. She had been standing near her father's truck this whole time, quiet. And now she stepped forward, past her mother, past her grandmother, and came to stand beside me on the sidewalk, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. "I'm the one who told Aunt Claire," she said, clearly, to the whole gathered group, her chin lifted in a way that reminded me, with a sudden ache, of exactly how Dottie used to stand. "I heard you and Mom talking about the truck and the timing. I told her because it was wrong, and I didn't want to be part of a family that thinks it's okay to just take things from people who love us." My mother turned to look at her granddaughter with an expression of pure, wounded betrayal, as though Mia's honesty were a greater sin than the plan it had exposed. "Mia," she started. "No," Mia said, and her voice, 16 years old, shook slightly but did not stop. "You've spent my whole life telling me family means loyalty. I think family should mean not lying to the people you love. I chose the second one." They had no idea that morning that the moving truck sitting empty and useless on Birchwood Lane was only the first collapse of many still to come. And they had no idea that the woman standing calmly on her own front porch, watching her mother's carefully built story disintegrate in real time, was only getting started. The immediate aftermath of that Saturday unfolded over the following days in a series of smaller, quieter collapses that I want to walk you through carefully, because I think this is the part of the story people often skip past too quickly. The part where the consequences actually land, unglamorously, in kitchens and phone calls and long silences, rather than in one clean, dramatic scene. The moving truck, in the end, was driven away empty by Rick that same afternoon, 3 hours late according to the rental agreement, which cost him an additional $89 in late fees he did not have. Denise and the children went home with him, in near total silence, according to what Mia told me later. A silence that lasted, apparently, for most of the following week, broken only by Denise finally confronting Rick directly about the missing money from his old job. A confrontation that ended, according to Mia, with Rick sleeping on the couch for 11 consecutive nights. My mother did not speak to me for 9 days after that Saturday. I did not call her either. I want to be honest about how that silence felt, because it was not entirely the triumphant, cleansing silence you might expect from a story like this one. It was heavy. It ached, in the particular way that estrangement from a parent always aches, even a parent who has hurt you, even a parent you know with total clarity was wrong. Grief does not care about who was right. It only cares about what has been lost. And something had been lost that week, even if what remained had needed badly to be lost. On the 10th day, my father called. I almost did not answer, but something in me, curiosity maybe, or simply the fact that my father so rarely initiated anything, made me pick up. Your mother isn't sleeping, he said, without preamble, in the flat, careful voice he always used when he was trying to broker peace without actually taking a side. She's been reviewing the trust paperwork with a lawyer of her own, trying to see if there's a way to challenge Dottie's clause. I felt something tighten in my chest. Is there? Her lawyer told her no, my father said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, an exhaustion finally letting go of a rope it had been gripping too tightly for too long. He told her the clause is airtight. He told her Martin Reyes drafted it specifically to survive exactly this kind of challenge, and that pursuing it further would just cost her money she doesn't have and make the whole situation worse. I did not say anything for a moment. My father, on the other end of the line, exhaled slowly. I should have said something at Easter, he said finally. I've been thinking about that a lot. I sat there and watched your mother give away your house like it was a casserole dish, and I didn't say a word, because I never say a word. And I think, Claire, I think I've spent so many years staying quiet to keep the peace that I forgot the peace was never actually fair to begin with. It was just quiet. I did not expect that from my father. In 47 years, I do not think I had ever heard him describe his own silence as a choice, rather than simply a fact of who he was. And something about hearing it named out loud, finally, loosened something in my chest I had not realized was still clenched. Thank you for saying that now, I said. It's not nothing, even if it's late. I'd like to come see you, he said. Just me. Your mother isn't ready, and honestly, Claire, I'm not sure I'm ready to referee whatever conversation you two eventually need to have. But I'd like to see the house. I'd like to see what you built. He came the following Sunday, alone, and I made him coffee in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had read Dottie's letter 6 weeks earlier, and he walked slowly through the rooms of Birchwood Lane, running his hand along the refinished floors, standing for a long moment in front of the garden window, looking out at the roses I had planted to match his mother's. She would have loved this house, he said quietly, meaning Dottie, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion about his own mother I had heard from him in years. I miss her. I don't say that enough. I think some part of me has always known she saw all of us more clearly than we saw ourselves, and that's a hard thing to sit with, when you're the son who let his wife run the whole show for 40 years and never once asked whether the show was fair. I did not push him further than he was ready to go. I have learned over the years that some doors open slowly, and that forcing them only teaches the person on the other side to bolt them shut again. My father and I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours that Sunday, talking mostly about small things: his garden, a book he was reading, a memory of Dottie teaching him to fish on Kelly's Island when he was a boy. And it was, in its quiet way, one of the most honest conversations we had ever had. Carol, meanwhile, had become something between an ally and a strategist in the weeks that followed. It was Carol who told me, about 3 weeks after the Saturday confrontation, that word had begun spreading through the wider family, aunts, cousins, family friends who had known Dottie, about what had actually happened, and that the spreading version of events was not the one my mother had hoped for. People remember Dottie, Carol told me over coffee at her kitchen table. People remember how much she loved you, and how carefully she built things. When they hear that Linda tried to change the will before Dottie died, and then tried to seize your house 11 years later while you were supposedly out of town, the story doesn't need any embellishment, Claire. It tells itself. I want to pause here and say something honest about how I felt during those weeks, because I think it matters, and because I do not want this to read as a story about a woman who felt nothing but cold satisfaction watching her family's collapse. I felt satisfaction, yes, in moments. The specific, sharp satisfaction of watching a lie finally meet daylight after 30 years of being allowed to live in shadow. But underneath that satisfaction was something sadder and more complicated. A grief for the family I had wished I'd had, the one where my mother's love had never needed to be earned or rationed, the one where Denise and I might have grown up as true allies instead of two women shaped, in opposite directions, by the same unequal hand. That grief did not disappear just because I had won something. It simply sat alongside the satisfaction, the way grief and relief often sit side by side in a person's chest after any long, difficult ending. Denise called me for the first time about 5 weeks after the confrontation, in early September, her voice raw and different than I had heard it in years. "I'm not calling to ask you for anything," she said quickly, before I could even respond. "I want to be clear about that first, because I think that's probably what you're braced for." "Okay," I said carefully. "Rick and I are separating," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "I found out it wasn't just the $4,000 from his old job. There's more, Claire. Gambling. Online, mostly. Going back almost 2 years. I don't even know what we are anymore. Broke doesn't cover it." I did not say "I told you so," because there was nothing in me that wanted to say it, and because I do not think it would have been true even if I had wanted to. I had not, in fact, told her so, not directly. I had simply refused to let her chaos become my collateral, which was a different thing entirely, and standing on the other side of that refusal now, listening to my sister's voice break apart on the phone, I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, sad and tired, and something that surprised me, a flicker of the old protectiveness I used to feel toward her, back before we had grown into two such different women. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm sorry it's this hard." "I understand now why you said no," Denise said quietly. "I think some part of me always understood it, actually. I think I just needed it to be your fault instead of ours, because that was easier than looking at what Rick and I had actually built, or hadn't built." We talked for almost an hour that day, longer than we had talked honestly in years. And it was not a full repair. I want to be clear about that, because I do not think this story ends with my sister and me suddenly close in the way we perhaps should have been all along. Some damage does not fully undo itself just because the truth finally arrives. But it was a beginning, a door left open a crack rather than bolted shut. And in the months that followed, Denise and I built something smaller and more honest than what we'd had before, which turned out, in the end, to be worth considerably more. Mia moved in with me, temporarily, 3 weeks after that phone call, while Denise sorted out the separation and found a smaller apartment closer to her work. It was meant to be temporary, a few weeks to give the household some breathing room while things settled, and it turned into something that lasted, in the end, far longer than either of us expected, for reasons that had less to do with logistics and more to do with the particular ease that had grown between us, quietly, over years of small kindnesses that had never asked anything in return. They had no idea, back at that Easter table months earlier, that the 16-year-old girl sitting quietly at the far end, watching everything, would end up being the person who both exposed the plan and, in the end, ended up living in the very house they had tried to take from me. Some kinds of justice, I have learned, arrive slowly and land somewhere far more meaningful than the place you originally aimed them. But my mother, Linda, had not yet had her final reckoning. That was still to come, and it would happen, fittingly, at the one place in this entire story that had always mattered most to her: the lake house on Kelly's Island. The invitation to Kelly's Island that October came from Carol, not from my mother, which told me almost everything I needed to know before I even opened the email. Every year, for as long as I could remember, the extended family gathered at the lake house for a long weekend in early October, before the property closed up for winter. Aunts, uncles, cousins, whoever could make the ferry crossing, a tradition that had started with Dottie decades earlier and had continued, unevenly, in the years since her death. My mother usually organized it. This year, Carol had, quietly, taken over the arrangements, and when I asked her why over the phone, she was blunt in a way I appreciated. "Because your mother is not currently in a position to organize anything gracefully," Carol said. "And because I think this family needs to see, all together, in the place Dottie loved most, exactly what almost got thrown away, and exactly what's still standing because it didn't." I almost did not go. I want to admit that honestly. Some part of me, even months after that Saturday on Birchwood Lane, still flinched at the idea of an entire weekend surrounded by extended family, uncertain how many of them had heard which version of events, uncertain whether I would be walking into more judgment or, for the first time in my life, something like vindication. Carol convinced me. Dottie built that clause specifically so this house would still be standing, whole, for the people who actually deserved it, she said. Don't let your mother's shame keep you away from the one place that was always supposed to be safe. So I went. Mia came with me. She was living with me full-time by then, enrolled in her new school district, the window seat room on the second floor of Birchwood Lane, now unmistakably hers, string lights and photographs, and the particular controlled chaos of a 16-year-old's bedroom. And we took the ferry together on a crisp Friday morning, the lake gray-green and choppy under a high, clear sky, gulls wheeling overhead, and something in me eased slightly the moment the mainland disappeared behind us. The lake house itself was exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Weathered gray shingles, a wide screened porch facing the water, the same creaking porch swing Dottie used to sit in every evening with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun go down over Lake Erie like it was a private performance staged just for her. Walking up that gravel path with my suitcase in hand, I felt her presence so strongly, It was almost like grief and comfort arriving at once, in the same breath. My mother was already there when Mia and I arrived, sitting on the screened porch in a way that made clear she had been waiting and watching. She looked older than I remembered her looking even a few months earlier. Thinner, somehow, her usual crisp composure replaced by something more brittle. A woman visibly carrying the weight of a story that had gotten away from her. She did not stand up when I came onto the porch. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. "I almost lost this place because of me," she said finally, quietly, not quite looking at me. "My own lawyer told me that, in plain words, if that truck had unloaded a single box into your house, Claire, I would have forfeited my claim to the one place in this world that still feels like my mother is alive somewhere in the walls of it." "I know," I said. "I keep trying to understand how I got there," she said, and her voice, for the first time in this entire story, did not sound like a performance of vulnerability designed to redirect a conversation. It sounded like an actual accounting, uncertain and unpolished, a woman genuinely trying to trace the shape of her own failure. "I told myself for months that I was helping Denise. That's all I could see. I couldn't see what I was doing to you, because somewhere along the way, Claire, I stopped being able to see you as someone who could be hurt by me at all. I think I decided, a long time ago, that you were the strong one, and strong people don't need protecting, so I never worried about protecting you. I only worried about protecting Denise, because she always seemed like the one who might break." I sat down slowly in the chair across from her. The same chair, I realized, where Dottie used to sit with her tea. "Being the strong one isn't the same as not needing anything, Mom," I said. "It just means I learned not to ask." My mother's eyes filled, and for once I did not think it was performance. "I called you the easy one my whole life like it was a compliment," she said. "I think I finally understand, sitting here about to lose the one place my mother left me, that I meant it as a way of telling myself I didn't have to try very hard with you, that you'd absorb whatever I decided because you always had." "I'm not her anymore," I said quietly. "I don't think I ever should have been." We sat there for a long time in silence, the lake wind moving through the screens, gulls calling somewhere out over the water, and I did not offer her the easy forgiveness she might have wanted. And she, to her credit, did not ask for it. What passed between us on that porch was not reconciliation, not fully, not yet. It was something smaller and more honest, an acknowledgement, finally spoken aloud, of a pattern that had shaped both our lives for nearly 5 decades, and the first tentative suggestion from a woman who had never once apologized to me in my entire adult life that she understood, at last, what that pattern had cost. The weekend that followed was not a fairy tale reconciliation. Denise arrived Saturday morning, quieter and thinner than I remembered, in the early, raw stages of her separation from Rick, and the two of us spent an hour walking the shoreline together, mostly in silence, occasionally talking about small things. Sophie's new obsession with a cartoon about dinosaurs, Tyler's middle school soccer team, the particular blue-green color the lake turned in the late afternoon light. It was not everything, but it was real, in a way that very little between us had been in years, and I found myself, walking along that rocky shore beside my sister, feeling something I had not expected to feel again, a small, careful hope. My father spent most of that weekend doing something I had genuinely never seen him do before. He actually organized things. He ran the grill Saturday night. He herded cousins into a group photo on the dock at sunset, the same spot where Dottie used to insist on a photo every single year. And when he handed his phone to a passing cousin to take the picture, he pulled me in beside him with a firmness that surprised me. his arm around my shoulders in a way that felt, for the first time in years, like a father actually choosing his daughter rather than simply tolerating her presence. Extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who had heard some version of the Birchwood Lane story through the family grapevine over the preceding months, treated me that weekend with a kind of quiet warmth I had not experienced from this family in longer than I could remember. My cousin Denny, Carol's son, pulled me aside on the dock Saturday evening with a beer in each hand and said simply, "Dottie would be proud of you, you know. Standing your ground like that. She always said you were the one who actually listened when she talked." Mia spent most of the weekend fishing off the dock with my father, the two of them an unlikely pair, my quiet, conflict-avoidant father and my sharp, watchful niece, bonding, it seemed, over the simple, wordless rhythm of casting and waiting. And watching them together, I thought about Dottie teaching my father to fish on this same dock decades earlier, and felt something settle into place. A sense that whatever had broken in this family, something else, quieter and more resilient, was slowly being rebuilt in its place. They had no idea, back at that Easter table 6 months earlier, that the family gathering at the lake house that October would look so entirely different from every family gathering that had come before it. And none of them yet knew that the biggest change of all was still waiting, patiently, back home in Columbus, in a small architecture and design studio I had quietly begun leasing space for 3 weeks earlier. The first real expansion of the business I had built alone, on my own terms, out of a life nobody had ever handed me. I want to take you forward now, about a year past that October weekend on Kelly's Island, because I think the ending of this story matters less as a single dramatic moment and more as a shape. The shape of what a life actually looks like once you stop letting other people's emergencies define the boundaries of your own. Birchwood Lane first. The house itself had changed in that year, not structurally, but in feeling. Mia's presence had filled it with a kind of ordinary, chaotic warmth that I found I loved more than I expected to. There were sneakers by the front door that were not mine. There was a corkboard in the kitchen, covered in photographs and concert ticket stubs, and a college acceptance letter from Ohio State that Mia had gotten in the spring. Early admission, which she had run into my office waving over her head with a joy so pure it had made me cry. Standing there in my staging binders and paint swatches, watching my niece's whole future open up in front of her. She still lived with me that fall, commuting to her first semester of classes, and we had, by then, developed the kind of easy domestic rhythm that I think both of us, in different ways, had been quietly starving for our whole lives. Sunday breakfasts, an ongoing argument about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher, a standing Thursday night tradition of watching bad reality television together on the couch that neither of us would ever admit to enjoying as much as we did. My business, the small design and staging practice I had built alone over 15 years, had grown in a way I had not anticipated. The story of what happened on Birchwood Lane, softened, of course, stripped of names, but recognizable enough within certain circles, had somehow made its way into a regional lifestyle magazine profile about women who had rebuilt their lives and their careers after family upheaval. And the exposure, unexpectedly, had brought in a wave of new clients, enough that I had leased a small second office and hired my first employee, a bright, eager 26-year-old named Priya, who reminded me, in certain moments, of exactly how hungry and unproven I had once been myself. Denise and I spoke regularly by then, not daily, not effortlessly, but regularly, in the particular careful way of two sisters rebuilding trust on a foundation that had cracked badly enough to require real repair, rather than simple patching. Her divorce from Rick had finalized in the spring, He had moved to Indiana, where I understood he was living with his brother, and slowly, painfully, working through both his gambling debts and, according to Denise, an actual program he had finally agreed to attend. I did not feel triumphant about Rick's collapse in the end. I felt, mostly, a tired kind of sympathy for the wreckage he had made of his own life, and a fierce protectiveness for the 3 children caught inside it. Denise had moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with Tyler and Sophie, closer to her sister-in-law's house than to my parents', and had gone back to school part-time, of all things, pursuing a certification in medical billing that she completed, eventually, with something like the same quiet, stubborn pride I recognized from my own younger self. "I never had to build anything on my own before," she told me once, over coffee at my kitchen table, Sophie coloring quietly at the counter behind us. "I always had someone catching me. I think I forgot I was capable of catching myself." My mother and I did not fully repair, not in the way movies suggest families repair, with a single tearful embrace that erases decades of pattern in an instant. We spoke perhaps twice a month by then, careful, sometimes strained conversations that occasionally slipped back into old grooves before catching themselves. She had, to her credit, never again mentioned the words "easy one" in my presence, and she had, in her own limited way, tried. Small gestures, an actual birthday card that arrived on time for the first time I could remember, an invitation to a lunch that she paid for without being asked, a slow, halting apology delivered in pieces over several conversations, rather than all at once, because I think some people are only capable of honesty administered in small doses, the way you give medicine to someone whose body has never had to process that particular truth before. I did not need her to be perfect. I had stopped needing that a long time ago, somewhere between the fireproof drawer and the lake house porch. What I needed, and what I slowly, imperfectly began to receive, was simply this: a mother who no longer assumed my compliance as a baseline condition of my existence in this family. That was enough. It had to be, and in its own quiet way, it actually was. My father and I grew closer that year than we had been in my entire life before it, in ways both large and small. He started calling me every Sunday just to talk, a habit that had never existed between us before. And twice that year, he drove out to Birchwood Lane on his own, without my mother, simply to sit in my garden among Dottie's roses and talk about nothing in particular, which, I came to understand, was his own quiet way of finally choosing me, consistently, the way he had never quite managed to when it mattered most. Martin Reyes and I had lunch together that following spring, on the anniversary, almost exactly, of the day I had first walked into his office with Dottie's letter still creased soft in my hands. "She'd be proud of you," he told me, over sandwiches at a small deli near his office. "Not just for winning. Anyone can win a fight once they have the right weapon. She'd be proud of how you did it, quietly, without cruelty. You gave your mother room to actually understand what she'd done, instead of just crushing her for having done it. That's rarer than you'd think in this line of work." I think about that conversation often, still. I think about the difference between winning and dismantling, between defending yourself and destroying someone, and I think, in the end, that the truest measure of what happened on Birchwood Lane, and later at that lake house, was not that my mother and sister lost something. It was that I finally, at 47 years old, stopped losing myself in order to keep them comfortable. I think about Dottie's letter often, too, the one that sat in a fireproof drawer for 11 years before I was ready to open it. I think about the particular kind of love it takes to build a shield for someone years before you know they'll need it. To trust that the person you're protecting will eventually grow into the strength required to use it. I do not think Dottie wanted me to become someone cold, or someone who kept score. or someone who took pleasure in her family's unraveling. I think she wanted, simply, for me to survive being underestimated without losing myself in the process, and to come out the other side of it still capable of love, just love with boundaries around it, love that required honesty instead of compliance. If you are listening to this, and some part of you recognized something in this story, a mother who assumes your yes before she's even asked the question, a sibling whose emergencies have somehow become your permanent responsibility, a family that has quietly decided your life exists to be useful to theirs rather than simply your own, I want you to hear something clearly, the way I wish someone had said it to me 30 years earlier. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say it plainly, without an elaborate justification, without waiting until you have built an airtight legal case to defend a boundary that should never have needed defending in the first place. Sometimes the case builds itself anyway, the way mine did, and sometimes it doesn't. And either way, your no does not require anyone else's permission to be valid. Love is not a lien on your life. Kinship is not a claim on your address, your savings, your time, or your body. The people who raised you do not automatically retain the right to redistribute what you built with your own two hands, simply because they once changed your diapers or paid for your childhood shoes. Gratitude is not the same as unlimited access, and the family members who love you the way you deserve to be loved will not need a trust attorney and a fireproof drawer full of documentation to eventually understand that your boundaries were never a betrayal. They were simply the truth, arriving, finally, in a shape too solid to argue with. I still live at Birchwood Lane. The roses still bloom every June along the back fence, the same deep red as Dottie's. And some evenings, when the light comes in low and gold through the kitchen window, I think I can almost feel her there, at the table, the way she used to sit with her tea and tell me that someday I would have a house with good bones and better light, and that when I found it, nobody would ever be able to take it from me. She was right about that. She made sure of it, quietly, years before any of us knew we'd need her to. If this story reminded you of your own family, of your own quiet no that never got said, or the one that finally did, I would love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you decided in the end that you were no longer willing to give away. And if this story meant something to you, if it gave you even a small piece of language for a boundary you've been carrying alone, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about the quiet, unglamorous work of finally being believed, even if the first person who has to believe you is yourself. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. I will see you in the next one.